All right, so we're back, and today we're really going deep into something that's been all over the news lately, the whole Israel-Hamas situation. Specifically, we're going to zero in on that ceasefire that's, well, it's kind of hanging on by a thread right now. And also this new proposal that's come up for a permanent truce. So, like, to really get a handle on this whole thing,
Okay.
we've gathered up, like, tons of articles, reports, all that good stuff from all sorts of sources. I'm talking Al Jazeera, the New York Times,
Right.
even RM Online. We went international with this, and it's actually really cool to see how, how different these perspectives are depending on where the reporting is coming from.
Yeah.
So, today what we're really trying to do is to, like, figure out what each side in all this, and they're really hoping to get out of this, and what are the things that are making it so hard to actually get to, any kind of lasting peace.
Right.
And to add, like, a whole other dimension to this, we're also going to get into the story of the Babis family.
Yeah.
Because their situation is really directly tied to the outcome of all these talks and negotiations and everything.
That's what makes this so fascinating, right? It's not just, armies and politicians moving pieces around on a board. We're talking about real lives, real people caught right in the middle of this. And that just adds this whole sense of urgency to everything that's going on.
Right. Absolutely. So let's just dive right in, start with where we are now. We've got this ceasefire. Went into effect back on January 19th of this year. But just from what I've been reading, it seems incredibly fragile. Is that a fair assessment?
Fragile. That is like the perfect word for it. I mean, both sides are out there pointing fingers, saying the other one's breaking the rules.
Right.
And that just, totally eats away at any trust that might be there. Makes it, 10 times harder to move forward. Plus, we've got this deadline looming.
Oh, yeah.
This first phase of the ceasefire, it's set to expire on March 1st. So there's like a serious time crunch here to get something done.
And then right smack in the middle of all this tension, Hamas comes out with this, some would say it's a pretty audacious proposal, talking about releasing all the remaining captives they've got.
Right.
In exchange for, okay, get this, a permanent ceasefire and Israel completely pulling out of Gaza.
Wow.
Some people might even say that's completely unrealistic. So the question is Hamas really ready to make some compromises here, or is this just some kind of ploy to get the world on their side?
Yeah, it's definitely a bold move, that's for sure, especially when you look at the history of this whole conflict. Right. And important to remember, this isn't just about, who controls which piece of land.
Right.
It's about, legitimacy. Who has the power?
Right.
Hamas has always, flat out refused to even talk about disarming or leaving Gaza. In fact, one spokesperson even went so far as to call it, get this, a ridiculous psychological war.
Wow.
Now, that statement right there, that tells you a lot about how Hamas sees themselves. They're not just some, rogue group. They see themselves as a real governing force.
So they're basically saying, this is our line and we're not moving. But what's the reasoning behind this offer? Are they serious about this truth, or is there something else going on beneath the surface?
Well, according to someone high up in Hamas, this offer is their way of showing that they are committed to actually resolving this conflict.
Okay.
They're saying we're ready for a lasting truth. And remember that first part of this whole ceasefire involved a prisoner exchange?
Right.
19 Israelis went free in exchange for over 1,100 Palestinians.
Oh.
And this kind of phased release approach, it seems to have built up some momentum, some level of trust, but the numbers tell you there's a long way to go. Still got 58 Israeli captives being held in Gaza.
So even if this whole prisoner exchange thing actually works out, there's a lot more to all of this.
Right.
And from what I understand, the prisoner exchange itself, that's not even the only problem, right? There are other things that are making it really hard to even think about a lasting peace. What are some of those other obstacles?
Oh, man, you're talking about some really, really deep-rooted problems. Decades of just distrust piled on top of conflicting demands.
Yeah.
It's a huge challenge. For example, you've got the whole question of the Philadelphia corridor. That's that tiny strip of land between Gaza and Egypt. Super strategically important to both sides. And then you throw on top of that this whole really controversial U.S. plan to relocate Gaza's population.
Right.
It's just adding another layer of crazy complexity to an already incredibly difficult situation.
It sounds impossibly complicated, honestly. And then on top of all that, you have to factor in all the political pressures on each side.
Oh, yeah.
I was reading that even within Netanyahu's own coalition, there are people who don't agree with what's being proposed.
Exactly. It's not just a conflict between two sides. It's like a struggle within each side, too.
Right.
Netanyahu's got to balance all that internal political stuff against the very real human cost of this conflict going on and on. And those costs, they just keep going up.
Yeah, and the numbers are absolutely devastating. I mean, the Gaza Ministry of Health, they're reporting over 48,000 Palestinian deaths.
It's unbelievable.
And some sources are even saying the number could be as high as like 61,000.
Wow.
With over 110,000 wounded, and that's just in Gaza. And then in Israel, those initial attacks by Hamas that resulted in the deaths of at least 1,139 people. I mean, it's hard to even grasp numbers that big.
It's staggering, isn't it? And we can't forget the financial burden of all this either. The World Bank, UN, and the EU, they're estimating it'll take something like $53.2 billion to rebuild Gaza.
Oh, wow.
Just a massive reminder of how long the consequences of this last, even if they somehow manage to get a ceasefire in place.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the politics and the statistics and all that, but then you come across a story like the Bibas family.
Right.
And it just brings the human cost of this conflict into such sharp focus.
Absolutely. I mean, their story, it's tragic and it's symbolic all at the same time.
Yeah.
Shiri, Yarden, and their two little boys, Ariel and Kafir, they were captured during that attack on Israel back on October 7th, 2023. Now, Yarden was actually released as part of the ceasefire earlier this month.
Oh, okay.
But for a long time, no one knew what happened to Shiri and the boys.
And reading about those final texts that Yarden sent from the safe room, it's just heartbreaking. It's like, I love you all, and then they're coming in, it just gets to you, you know? And for over a year, the family just held on to this hope, even though Hamas was saying that Shiri and the boys had been killed in an Israeli airstrike, a claim that Israel never confirmed.
It's incredibly tough to hear.
It really is. And tragically, just this week, Hamas agreed to return the bodies of the Bibas family. And while it's, a sad development, at least it brings some closure for the family. Although I can't imagine what they're going through.
Yeah.
This story is just one example of, how this conflict has just shattered so many lives. It makes you wonder, is a lasting peace even possible when the wounds run so deep?
That's the question that keeps coming up, right? And I think to even try to answer that, we have to look beyond just these negotiations that are happening right now.
Okay.
And really examine what's at the root of it all. What does sustainable peace actually look like in a place like this? Is it just like no more fighting? Or does it require something much deeper, some kind of, reconciliation where both sides feel secure and, respected?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question. And honestly, I think a lasting peace, it takes more than just a ceasefire.
Right.
It's about addressing the inequalities, the feeling that things are unfair, the lack of basic freedoms.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. A true peace, it requires some really tough conversations and compromises that are going to be painful.
Yeah.
But it's clear that the way things are now, it's just not working. The human costs, it's way too high.
And that's where the story of the Bibas family, it becomes so important.
Yeah.
It represents like the human face of this whole thing, those individual tragedies that are so easy to forget when you're talking about geopolitics and military strategy.
It's a stark reminder that peace isn't just some, abstract idea.
Yeah.
It's about real lives, real families, hopes, dreams.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that even when things are as dark as they seem right now, there's still that capacity for hope, compassion, forgiveness.
That's such an important point because without that hope, without that belief that things can actually change, what's the point of even trying? And that brings us back to what's happening right now. Will this proposal from Hamas, will that be a step toward real peace, or will it just make things worse? There are just no easy answers here.
And to make things even more complicated, Hamas just agreed to release more captives in the next prisoner swap. Instead of 3, they're now saying they'll release 6.
Whoa, hold on, really?
Yeah, it's because the mediators asked them to. And it shows how committed they are to making this work.
That's a pretty big move. Makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes. What kind of pressure are these mediators putting on them, and what are they really hoping to achieve in the end?
Well, we know the U.S. has been involved in all this. President Trump himself even criticized that whole phased release of captives. He said they should all be freed at the same time.
Wow, okay.
So yeah, there's definitely pressure coming from outside. But you got to remember, Hamas isn't just one big unified group.
Right.
There are different factions within the organization, each with their own agenda, their own calculations.
It really is a complicated situation. It's like some kind of like high-stakes chess game with all these players making their moves and counter moves. And in the middle of it all, you have the people of Gaza just trying to rebuild their lives after so much devastation.
It's hard to even fathom, entire neighborhoods are just rubble.
Right.
The constant fear that the violence will start up again, not even having basic necessities. And beyond even that, there's the psychological trauma, the grief, the uncertainty. It's a humanitarian crisis on a massive scale.
Yeah. And to add to all of that, we were reading that Israel still controls the flow of aid and rebuilding materials into Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of power in their hands, and I can definitely see how that could lead to more tension.
Oh, absolutely. That control over the aid, it gives Israel a lot of leverage in these negotiations, but it also fuels resentment and mistrust among Palestinians,
Right.
which could be a huge obstacle to ever getting to a lasting peace. One expert even said that Israel is essentially calling the shots on how fast and how Gaza is rebuilt.
Wow.
And as long as people are stood without proper housing, without basic supplies, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to get their lives back on track.
It just like feeds into this whole cycle of mistrust, doesn't it?
Exactly.
If one side feels like the other side is deliberately making it hard for them to recover, how can you even begin to build a foundation for peace?
You're absolutely right. And that brings us back to that fundamental question, right? What does a sustainable peace actually look like? What do you think, based on everything we've discussed so far?
I mean, that's the question, isn't it? And it's one that we're going to keep digging into as we continue our deep dive into this whole situation.
It really feels like we're at this crucial moment. What happens over the next few weeks that could really determine what direction this conflict takes for years to come.
Yeah, no pressure, right? But the stakes, they really are incredibly high. We've been talking about the human cost, all the political complexities, the economic burden. But on top of all of that, there's also the very real possibility that things could escalate even further and spill over into neighboring countries and regions.
Exactly. This isn't just a regional issue. The whole world's watching. It has global implications.
Yeah, it really does.
That's why it's so important to stay informed, to really get the nuances of this conflict and not just skim the headlines,
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive in the first place.
Exactly.
All about peeling back those layers, looking at all the different sides, and really questioning our own assumptions. I mean, if we don't even understand what's going on, how can we even hope to be part of a more peaceful future?
Couldn't agree more. So where do we go from here? What are the things we need to be looking at, paying attention to as this story unfolds?
Yeah, that's the question, right? It feels like there are a few different paths this whole thing could take.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think? I mean, what's the most likely outcome?
Well, one possibility is that these negotiations just hit a wall.
Right.
The mistrust is too deep. What each side wants is just too far apart.
Mm-hmm.
And we end up back where we started with more violence. It's a real risk, and honestly, it would be a disaster for everybody.
Yeah, that's a pretty grim thought, but definitely a possibility. Okay, but what about, I don't know, maybe some kind of partial agreement, like another round of prisoner releases or extending the ceasefire?
Mm-hmm.
Could that be a way to at least move things forward a little bit?
Yeah, it would buy some time, but it wouldn't really solve the root problems. It would just be a temporary fix, not a real lasting solution.
Okay, so not ideal, but better than all-out war, right? But is there any chance of something more optimistic happening? Could we actually see a real breakthrough in these talks, like a genuine commitment to peace from both sides?
I mean, it's hard to imagine, given, everything that's happened over the years.
Yeah.
But I think we have to hold on to that possibility, no matter how small it might seem.
Right.
If we lose hope, then we're basically giving up on the future.
You're right. We have to believe that a better future is possible, but realistically, I mean, what would it actually take to achieve a real lasting peace in a situation like this?
It would take both sides being willing to make some incredibly tough choices, to compromise on things that they've always held as non-negotiable. It would also require a total shift in how Israelis and Palestinians relate to each other, a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding.
That's a tall order, but it's clear that something has to change. The way things are now, it's just not sustainable.
Exactly. And that's where, the story of the Bibas family, it becomes so powerful.
Yeah.
Their story reminds us that peace isn't just some theoretical concept.
Right.
It's about real lives, real families, their hopes and dreams.
Their story also really drives home the human cost of this conflict. The cost that gets lost in all the political talk.
Mm-hmm.
It's so easy to get caught up in all the arguments about land and security and all of that.
Yeah.
But in the end, this conflict, it's about people, their lives, their futures.
It's a reminder that peace isn't about, signing documents or drawing lines on a map.
Right.
It's about building a world where families like the Bebeses don't have to live in constant fear.
Right.
Where their kids can grow up safe and secure.
And that brings us back to what you said earlier, that question of what role can we play in all of this? How can we foster understanding and, actually promote peace, not just in our own communities, but on a global scale?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves, because ultimately, peace isn't something that just happens to us.
Yeah.
It's something we have to actively create through our actions, our words, our choices.
That's a powerful thought. And it reminds me that even though this conflict might seem so distant and so overwhelming, there are things we can do, even if small, to make a difference.
Absolutely. Whether it's staying informed, having thoughtful conversations, supporting organizations that are working for peace, every little bit counts.
And maybe the most important thing we can do is to never lose hope,
Mm-hmm.
to always believe that a better world is possible.
I totally agree. Without hope, there can't be any change. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the Israel-Hamas conflict, I want to leave you with this thought. What can you do, even if it's just a small step, to help create a more peaceful world? It's something worth thinking about.
Thank you for being with us as we explore this really complex and challenging issue. It's a difficult conversation, but so incredibly important.
And as always, we encourage you to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged, because together we can make a difference.
It feels like, even after all this, we've barely scratched the surface of this whole thing.
Yeah.
And there are just so many layers to this conflict. It's easy to feel totally overwhelmed.
It's true. This isn't something that just popped up overnight, right? We're talking decades of conflict.
Right.
Deep roots in history, in people's identities, in the whole power dynamic.
Right. It's not something with an easy fix. So as we try to make sense of all of this, what are some of the key things we should be keeping in mind going forward?
Well, first and foremost, we got to remember that there are real people, real lives being impacted by this conflict every single day. I mean, we talked about the Beavis family, but their story, that's just one of, countless tragedies that have happened because of this ongoing struggle.
It's so easy to get caught up in the politics, the strategy, all that, but we just can't lose sight of that human element.
Absolutely. And the other thing is, there's no simple solution here. This isn't a conflict where there's a clear right and wrong.
Right.
There's deep pain, conflicting stories on both sides. And to get to any kind of peace, both sides are going to have to make some really tough compromises.
Yeah.
And they're going to have to be willing to see things from the other side's point of view.
It sounds like empathy is going to be a key ingredient if there's ever going to be any hope of a successful peace process.
It's absolutely crucial. If you don't have empathy, if you can't even try to understand the other side's pain, see things from their perspective, there's no way you can even begin to talk about reconciliation.
So, as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what are some of the things that you hope our listeners will take away from all of this?
I'm hoping they come away from this with a much deeper understanding of how complex this whole thing is, and that they'll really grasp the human cost that's involved in all of this.
Yeah.
I'm also hoping it'll inspire them to stay engaged, to keep learning, and to look for ways, even small ways, to contribute to a more peaceful world.
Those are great takeaways. And I think it's also important to remember that even though this might seem like something happening far away, it's really connected to all these bigger global issues of justice, equality, human rights.
That's a great point. This conflict, it's like a microcosm of a lot of the challenges the world's facing right now. And the things we learn from it, we can apply those to other conflicts, other situations.
So as we leave our listeners with this final thought, what's something they can really reflect on as they continue learning about this and engaging with this issue?
I'd ask them to think about this. What are the root causes of this conflict? And how do those causes connect to the bigger picture, to what's happening globally? And maybe even more importantly, what can each of us do in our own lives, in our own communities, to promote understanding, empathy, and peace?
That's such a powerful question, and one that deserves a lot of thought. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the Israel-Hamas conflict. It's been a tough conversation, but an incredibly important one.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, even when faced with conflicts that seem impossible to solve, there's always hope for a better future. Don't ever give up on that hope.